Good evening. My name is Juan Cruz. I'm the Dean of the School of Fine Art here at the Royal College of Art. And welcome to our Visual Cultures lecture series. Tonight, in a moment, my colleague Jaspar Joseph-Lester, who's a reader in fine art here in art, urbanism, and the moving image, and research tutor in sculpture, will be presenting our speakers, Adrian Lahoud and David Cunningham, and I'll leave him to do that just in a moment. Our Visual Cultures lecture series is our public lecture series at the Royal College, and it's an opportunity for us to develop ideas and thoughts that we think are important to us, and we think also important to the production of art and culture today. Last year, our series touched on the theme of contemporaneity, which we thought of as this ungraspable concept. And we invited artists and critics, curators to come and talk about their perspectives on contemporaneity. This year's series, Rise Up and Envision, is an extension of that debate. But this year we've tried to look a little bit further and beyond our own field of art practice, to try and invite people who might come and talk around subjects that we think are of interest to us. And we know this through the tutorials that we have with our students, the kind of discussions that arise. We kind of have a sense that very often what we're talking about is not really art, but certain subjects that are dealt with through the subject. And so far we've had sessions that have talked about housing and occupation, the idea of how we dwell in the world today. We've touched on economics, the economics of the art world in relation to other kind of economics in the world. And in our last session we talked on, I suppose, a kind of form of agency and activism, thinking about the relationship of the agency of the hand to the agency of kind of broader and more kind of powerful political forces. So these are the kind of things that we've been talking about so far, and we have a couple of lectures left that will be coming up very soon. So we see this lecture series really as being quite generative, both in terms of the ideas that it generates kind of for us as researchers and also for us in our teaching in the studios, and also something that is really about us being able to reflect on the kind of things that are taking place around us, and also hopefully to be able to generate some new knowledge and new ideas. The format that we've adopted this year, one where we have people in conversation with each other, is really one which is attempting to do that, and it's sometimes quite unpredictable what might arise. One sometimes invites people to come and speak, and one knows what they'll speak about, but sometimes it can be a bit of a surprise, and that's interesting, I think, because it does challenge the ideas that we thought we were asking to speak about, and sometimes introduce new things. So. Without anything further, please, I'd like to introduce Jaspar Joseph-Lester, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Good evening. Welcome. Just before I introduce this evening's speakers, just a couple of thoughts on the series so far. I don't know if many of you attended the last Visual Cultures talk, or maybe you've seen it online, but it seemed to me to raise interesting questions around how we envision, and especially how we tackle this question of cultural and social transformation. It seemed to me that the talks from Jonas Stahl and Richard Sennett dealt with these very questions through a kind of very particular model for thinking. So on the one hand, we had the vibrato of the concert cellist, and on the other hand, we had a kind of staging of the political. In both cases, I would say they use the kind of model of the theatre as a way of thinking futures, as a way of thinking social transformation. I think tonight will be different. I think if we're going to talk about models for thinking, we're going to turn to the world as a model for thinking these futures and possible transformations, both cultural and social. So our speakers tonight are David Cunningham, who is reader in modern literature and culture at the University of Westminster, and a member of the editorial collective of the journal Radical Philosophy. He's published extensively, has new books coming out. The full list of titles is available on the net. I won't rattle through it. Our second speaker this evening is Adrian Lahoud, who is an architect, researcher, and educator. Prior to being appointed Dean of the School of Architecture here at the RCA. He was Director of Urban Design Masters at the Bartlett School of Architecture and served as a Director of the MA programme at the Centre for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths College. He was also involved with the research group at Goldsmiths Forensic Architecture. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's speakers. Thank you.
And thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so. I've probably got way more than 20 minutes written down here, but we'll cut it down. I'm not going to talk here, at least, but perhaps in the conversation afterwards, much about rising up, I guess, but perhaps some more about envisioning and some problems of visibility or invisibility. The title that Adrian and I had to speak under was Space, Data and Abstraction, and I suppose it's the first and last of those terms, space and abstraction, that I'm going to talk mostly about, perhaps a little bit elliptically about data. However, as my introduction made clear, my initial training was literary critic, so I'm going to begin with a couple of stories or a couple of narratives, two vignettes, which come from recent books, and specifically what I'm interested in is that they're the openings of these books. They're books that use these stories to set up their overall argument or something about what they want to say, in each instance around contemporary global capitalism. One is a broadly academic book and the other is a broadly journalistic book. The first of these, which this first image up here is partially illustrating, comes from Alexander Closer's book, The Container Principle, which was first published in German in 2009 and translated into English last year. And Closer begins his narrative on the morning of January the 18th, 2007, when a container ship sailing under the British flag in the English Channel was in distress. MSC Napoli, as pictured here, was the very beginning of its journey from Belgium to South Africa, Closer recounts, when it crossed the destructive path of Hurricane Kirill and was put aground off the coast of Cornwall. As a result of the continuing poor weather and an alarming starboard tilt of 35 degrees, 116 containers spilled into the sea. As Closer goes on to relate, a few dozen of these containers then washed ashore on the beach of the small, quiet coastal town of Branscombe in Devon, where they were, to the outrage of certain sections of the media. It's great to go back and look at the moral outrage of the Sun and the Daily Mail about this. They were descended upon by looters. Here's some of the pictures of looters on the beach at Branscombe taking the things out of the containers. My particular favourite in the top right there, the guy taking the luxury motorbike out of one of the containers. There were several of these. So Closer writes, the beach was said to be transformed into a supermarket, littered with gears, steering wheels and other spare car parts, along with wine barrels, cookie tins, first aid kits, perfume bottles, sneakers, diapers from Arabia, shoes from Cyprus, empty French barrels meant for South African wine, dog food, clothing, household appliances and toys, even a tractor washed up. For once, the boxes that were circulating in all parts of the world in such incalculable numbers had exposed their contents. For once, those hermetic boxes, which usually concealed their cargo even from the ship's crew and the dock workers, had opened. What the containers offered then, Closer concludes, was something like a cross-section of the present state of world culture of global consumer capitalism. The form of the list alongside the form of the narrative is key here, this kind of collage of apparently disparate items drawn together within this structure. In this sense, in literally revealing what is otherwise hidden, the shipwreck, Closer suggests, provides what he calls, quote, an impression, a kind of quasi-archaeological trace of not only the vast distribution systems of international container transport, but indeed of the capitalist remaking of the world itself. I'm going to come back to this then. My second story, though, moves from sea to land and comes from the beginning of the first chapter of financial journalist Michael Lewis's book on high-frequency trading, Flash Boys, published in 2014, in which Lewis begins the book by narrating the installing of a fibre optic cable between Chicago and New Jersey. These aren't laying a fibre optic cable between Chicago and New Jersey, but they are the machines that lay fibre optic cables. By the summer of 2009, Lewis writes, the line, he just calls it the line, has a life of its own. And 2,000 men were digging and boring the strange home it needed to survive. 205 crews of 8 men each, plus assorted advisors and inspectors, were now rising early to figure out how to blast a hole through some innocent mountain, or tunnel under some riverbed, or dig a trench beside a country road that lacked a roadside, all without ever answering the obvious question, why? The line was just a 1.5-inch wide hard black plastic tube designed to shelter found 100 hair-thin strands of glass, but it already had the feeling of a living creature, a subterranean reptile with its peculiar needs and wants. It needed its burrow to be straight, maybe the most insistently straight path ever dug into the earth. It needs to be straight. Part of the narrative, of course, is because this is about reducing time, and the straighter the line is, the quicker the signals move down the cables. It needed to connect a data center of the south side of Chicago to a stock exchange in northern New Jersey. This is a Google image of the stock exchange in New Jersey. These are very concealed places in all sorts of ways. Above all, apparently, it needed to be a secret. Like closest beach containers, what Lewis calls the line offers then a rare glimpse, apparently, of the flows and hidden material infrastructures of, as he puts it, a US stock market that now trades inside black boxes in heavily guarded buildings in New Jersey and Chicago, into which few are allowed to see, as well as of the forms of labour underlying it. At one level, what Closers and Lewis's books depicts is then, we might say, the continuance of what the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg once famously described as an epistemological model or paradigm emergent in the 19th century, in which it is, quote, infinitesimal traces that permit the comprehension of a deeper, otherwise unattainable reality. Traces that permit the comprehension of a deeper, otherwise unattainable reality. In this case, both Lewis and Closer suggest, a reality of global capitalism as such. As narrative form, of course, this is something like the terrain of the crime scene, in which the material residue of the act apparently establishes a certain relation of cause and effect. It is also organised around a certain structure of the hidden, the black boxed, of what cannot be seen. And it is no coincidence that Lewis's book in particular borrows much of its own narrative form from the generic conventions of the thriller. Yet I want to note, this is my argument, at another fundamental level, both these stories and the opaqueness of things that animate them, of underground fibre optic cables and corrugated containers, necessarily confront a further dilemma here also, suggested in part in the animism of Lewis's own peculiar image of the line as that which has a life of its own, a living creature, a subterranean reptile with its peculiar needs and wants. This is then a model, I think, that is slightly different from that engaged in Ginzburg's own epistemological model, which is perhaps still best encapsulated in a famous passage from Bertolt Brecht's account of the Threepenny Opera trial, in which he writes, quote, "The situation becomes so complicated today because less than at any time does a simple reproduction of reality tell us anything about reality. A photograph of the Krupp factories or the AEG, like, let us say, a data centre or a container ship, provides virtually no information about these institutions. True reality has, Brecht continues, slipped over into functional reality. The reification of human relations, the factory, let's say, no longer reveals these human relations to us." As Adorno comments, thinking of precisely this passage, if the world is to be seen through, it can apparently no longer be looked at. The ens realismum, the entity of reality, consists of processes, not immediate facts, Adorno writes, and they cannot be depicted. There's an interesting relation of photography in here, of course, in that photography in its classical indexical form is in a way the technology of the trace. Walter Ben Michaels has compared it to something like the fossil, that's something that literally leaves the trace of reality. It's this that underlies, in part as well, Benjamin's famous critique of new objectivity in A Little History of Photography, in what he regarded as photography's tendency to aestheticize the world of appearances. He writes that photography is unable to convey anything other than what a beautiful world. rendering even abject poverty, he suggests, into an object of enjoyment. And I guess this would be peculiarly familiar with that image of this today. This is an abandoned building in Detroit, of course. And in a sense, as a kind of a trace, both a photographic trace and itself as a trace of a certain history, a certain set of systems. This exemplifies something, I think, of these problems that I'm trying to touch upon here. The difficulty that is registered is then, I want to argue, albeit schematically, that there are, so to speak, two very different, albeit inextricably connected, forms of an unattainable reality, to use Ginsberg's phrase, at stake in all this. So, on the one hand, one which can in principle be at least partly rectified in narrative or the image, or which, at any rate, allows for the possibility of deciphering what Ginsberg describes as, quote, the traces of events that could not be directly experienced by the observer. On the other hand, however, there is also some essentially invisible unattainable reality, which just is intrinsic to the reality of capitalist modernity as such, the traces of which peculiarly point towards a reality that lies inherently outside the image or narration altogether, or, in Adorno's terms, what cannot be looked at. So let me try then to unpack what I mean by this distinction a little bit further. Now, crucially, as much politically as aesthetically, so to speak, what is at stake in the first conception of invisibility, which could be rectified in the image in principle, would be one, for example, that I think corresponds to what might be described as a social or political documentary emphasis on bringing into the field of vision, generally via a certain spatial reordering, what is otherwise invisible or anonymous. Or in other words, what is invisible from one site is here so because in one form or another it is temporally and spatially separated from it. Today, I guess there are two most obvious manifestations of this. On the one hand, the obvious globalization of production. So the revealing of, say, the processes by which iPhones are made in China by Foxconn, to take one celebrated example, in which, as the Italian novelist and activist Wu Ming put it, quote, putting the largest possible distance between upstream and downstream is the quintessential ideological operation under capitalism. In other words, the more spatially separated and disparate production and consumption are, the more hidden is one side from the other. But again, in principle, that's rectifiable. A journalist can go to a Foxconn factory, take photograph or film, write about it, and reveal that. The second element of this, I guess, would be the shift of production and key processes more generally from metropolitan centres to what Patrick Keeler identifies as the new landscapes which have evolved as a result of computer-driven change. Landscapes which are often peripheral to urban centres and either ephemeral and relatively insubstantial and hence effectively unseen, the logistics warehouse, the container port, the business park. This is some of Amazon's warehouses out in Phoenix, themselves quite difficult to get to. More specifically, and as both these examples suggest, today this invisibility is one often associated with the appearance of what notoriously Bill Gates once described as a friction-free capitalism ushered in by the internet and digitization. That is, the fantasy or myth of immateriality, in which abstraction appears to be realized as an actual separation from material structures or work. As an object of critique, among the best examples of an attempt to dissect such abstraction, that is, to bring it, in a sense, literally back down to earth, would then be, say, the photographic projects of the late Alan Sekula, many of which are themselves focused on containerization and sea trade. So typically, in his short introduction to a film made with Noel Birch, The Forgotten Space, Alan Sekula frames this here against what he calls the myths of a dematerialized post-industrial society in terms of a rendering visible of the otherwise hidden fact that sea trade remains, quote, an integral, indeed growing, component of the world industrial system, populated by, as he puts it, invisible workers on the other side of the globe. Visible workers on the other side of the globe. Again, the point here of invisibility is a point of temporal and spatial separation. And in principle, as in these images, the photograph, the trace of the photograph can bring into the other space of visibility those invisible workers. In which you can go out and you can take photographs of invisible workers, put them in art galleries or books or newspapers, and in some sense rectify that invisibility, render the invisible visible or the hidden unhidden. From a very different perspective then, a text like Michael Lewis's Flash Boys similarly acquires its narrative hold through its focus upon the all too material infrastructures, architectures and new landscapes that actually make possible the supposedly friction-free processes of contemporary capitalism. So part of the point, of course, of this opening story of them laying the fibre optic cable is to show, in fact, both the labour and the material processes and structures that necessarily go into the seemingly immaterial, friction-free world of digital communications. It's important in this respect, then, that there are now more than, for example, 5 million data centres worldwide, which together are among the world's largest users of energy. I know that Adrian's going to talk about climate change in a moment. And this is a crucial part of it. And while it is certainly true that, for example, any individual metre of cable is much thinner and lighter than, say, a railway line or a motorway, the incredible volume of cable being laid around the globe tends to lessen even this distinction. The logistics of containerization itself, too, it should be said, rely absolutely on computers and the internet. Indeed, in a sense, as Closer himself notes, containers are, quote, agents of the digital in the physical spaces of transport, which everything is subjected to the logic of the processing of standardized, clearly separate, discrete units. One of the reasons, then, that containers, apart from their sheer volume, have become emblematic of something fundamental to global capitalism as a whole is that among their effects is the fact that, as Closer puts it, quote, nowhere in the entirety of the global transport process can you see what is inside. Nowhere in the entirety of the global transport process can you see what is inside. And this is true for most of the moments of labour in the process of containerisation. So dock workers today never know for the most part what it is they're shifting, although they would only know precisely at the point of the kind of accident that I began with from Closer's book, when a container collapses, falls, a ship wrecks itself and so on, and then the objects inside become visible. Otherwise, they're entirely invisible throughout that global process. It's become, interestingly, quite a popular narrative device. That the second series of The Wire, if you remember, you've seen it, has a container coming accidentally open, and a pile of bodies falls out of it. You know, this is the moment at which seemingly these invisible cargoes everywhere become, for a moment, visible. So it's obvious why then this is a powerful allegory, or even we might say a kind of metonymy or a synecdoche of globalization, of global capital. However, and here's my second point, we need to recognise, I think, at least some limit here, or at least to recognise the way in which this is then cut across by what we might describe as a somewhat different problem of abstraction or invisibility, one which is, as it were, not so simply resolved in this spatial or temporal reordering. Now, part of the point about containers, of course, is that you can open them, or they can be opened by accident, and you can see what is hidden inside them. But what one sees is, in some sense, also not what is invisible here. One can open all the containers in the world and never quite see what it is that underlies the processes and logics of containerization. Now, the last thing the world needs is another account of the first chapter of Marx's Capital, but nonetheless I'm going to bore you with one very quickly, which is to suggest then that what is at stake here corresponds, in a sense quite directly, to two different but inextricably linked aspects of what Marx famously theorises in that first chapter of Capital as the fetish-like character of the commodity. That is, as he puts it, its double differentiated existence, at once perceptible and imperceptible by the senses, at once perceptible and imperceptible by the senses, as one translation of this first chapter has it. Now, for Sekula, it is its fetish-like character that precisely connects containerization to the commodity, in which, as one commentator on Marx puts it, quote, the concrete relationships of cooperation and dependency between different types of labour, in other words, what these guys here are doing, that are needed to produce commodities are invisible. They have no discernible social expression, end quote. This is precisely, of course, the basis for Capital's own famous metaphor of the phantasmagoria, in which social relations between people appear, as he puts it, as social relations between things, but where, like the phantasmagoric screen, the commodity is what Marx calls a social hieroglyph is indeed classically open to interpretation or decoding, at least at one level, so as to render visible the machinery that works behind it. As two recent art critics write, in this sense, something like Sekula's photographs are indeed, as they put it, traces put into the public domain of power structures that otherwise remain invisible. Yet if this is so, such traces are thus also marked, not unself-consciously in the case of Sekula, I think, by those profound limitations placed on what can be represented through such traces themselves. This relates in turn not only to what any work of representation must leave out, manifested in Sekula's work in the unrepresented intervals between the images displayed. Sekula tends to work in kind of narrative forms, but of course one can never narrativize everything, particularly in the complex chains that Sekula is trying to represent. But also what always determines, this is the crucial point, the very flows and networks of the world depicted, and hence the traces it leaves behind. Now for Marx, formed via exchanges abstraction from or absenting of the substance of use values, so as to make concretely different things exchangeable, what is historically specific about capitalism resides in the manner in which what originates in this determinate negation of substance, of use value, comes to take on a strange objectivity of its own, one that comes, as he puts it, to take possession of materiality itself. While this abstraction does not, of course, destroy the sensuous materiality of the bodies of commodities, insofar as it needs them to be the bearers or avatars of value, this is these, we think back to the lists of all the things tumbling out of the containers, it's full of sensuous materiality. Indeed, in some sense, this is the impetus behind that proliferation of things. But it subjects such materiality, or these things, to its own reality and movement. Given shape in the form of money in particular, abstraction here is then crucially not merely an effect of subjective consciousness, which we might dispel by seeing through it, but is that which is objectively constituted in the process of exchange, and thus assumes a contradictory reality as such. Famously, Marx writes in Capital, "Not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values." One has to pause and think about how strange that sentence is. Not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities as values. So commodities as values are indeed objective, they are in some sense objects, and yet they have not an atom of matter in them, Marx writes. In this, he continues, is the direct opposite of the coarsely sensuous objectivity of commodities as physical objects. Again, all those things tumbling out of the containers. It is in this sense, then, that we should understand the full and increasing force of Marx's claim that in capitalist modernity, human beings are indeed ruled by abstractions. If we take then containerization, but also a whole range of different infrastructural and logistic forms and processes, one would need to observe here a kind of abstraction of reality, or conversely, a materialization of abstraction at work in them. In this sense, what connects, say, the form of money and the form of the container, or for that matter in a very different realm, the data packet, say, is that both are what Closer calls meta-operators of circulation. Operators that smooth differences, create connections amid separation, and treat unequal things identically. Although Closer doesn't say so here, in a sense what he is describing is precisely the form of the commodity and of exchangeability, the capacity to treat unequal things identically. I'm going to end with a quote from another book. This is from Roberto Saviano's 2006 book, Gomorrah, which is a book which lies, I suppose, somewhere between fiction and non-fiction, or the novel and journalism, and which is focused on the Neapolitan Camorra, the mafia around Naples. Gomorrah begins with precisely, again, then these very concrete traces of commodity circulation, which are visible at the port of Naples. In a sense, like these narratives of laying the fibre optic cables or the container shipwreck, he begins from a very precise point, from the port of Naples. And he writes, everything that exists passed through here. There's not a product, fabric, piece of plastic, toy, hammer, shoe, screwdriver, bolt, video game, jacket, pair of pants, drill or watch that doesn't come through here. The port of Naples is an open wound, the end point for the interminable voyage that merchandise makes. Again, the form of the list mixing in there with the form of narrative, and the emphasis again is on the sensuous material stuff, one side of the commodity, as it were. Yet at the conclusion of the book, at the other end of this narrative, Gomorrah's own problematic version of a kind of realist epic or narrative form is articulated by Saviano in very particular terms. And it's this quote I think I'm going to end with. It's not hard to imagine something, Saviano writes, it's not hard to picture in your mind a person or gesture or something that doesn't exist. It's far more difficult to imagine the economy in all its aspects, the finances, profit percentages, negotiations, debts, and investments. There are no faces to visualize, nothing precise to fix in your mind. You may be able to picture the impact of the economy, we might say to picture the traces of the economy, but not its cash flows, its bank accounts, individual transactions. The question I end with then is the question of what I suppose this means, not only for representation, but also for politics. And I think there are two things that are worth very quickly sketching out, and perhaps we'll come back to them if we get a chance in the conversation. One is, of course, then the particular limits, which is not to say to deny the necessity of them, upon a certain kind of model of exposure of the hidden at this point. Which is not to say, of course, that one shouldn't expose appalling practices in sweatshops or whatever in China, or that one shouldn't wish to see inside the containers to see what is moving around this system, or to understand where those fibre optic cables are going, and so on. It is, however, to recognise the limits of that removal of a certain invisibility to reveal the visibly concrete in that sense. Think of it like, I mentioned the comparison with the crime novel at the beginning. And the crime novel, of course, is a very seductive form, but the crime novel always relies in the sense on the end that you will resolve the crime and it will be reduced to one person and one object. The vicar did do it with the candlestick in the library. The problem here, of course, is that one is dealing with processes and forms of abstraction that are not themselves visualizable in that sense, or can only be rendered visible as invisible, in their invisibility in some way. And that's quite a different kind of critical project. It doesn't mean dismissing the first one, but it means that it has to be, in some sense, supplemented with the second. The other, I suppose, is what it means, perhaps this is the rise up and envision bit to finally end with, apologies not getting to it sooner, is what this means for our capacity to think about the future. If we don't think, as I don't, that it's possible to undo these processes of abstraction per se, what would be a politics of abstraction that would precisely not be governed by capital. Insofar as the process of abstraction and systems and structures of abstraction we've been describing are dominated, determined and governed by capital dominantly. What would it mean to think at equivalent level of abstraction, but from a position outside of the value form and outside of exchangeability? Perhaps that was what something like socialism was always meant to mean. Anyway, I shall finish there. Thank you.